On a cold winter morning in January 1722, inside a government office in Moscow, under the authority of Peter the Great, a clerk dipped his quill into ink and carefully rewrote a man's name into an official registry, transforming what had once been a fluid, living identity into a fixed and permanent label that would follow not only that individual, but his descendants for generations. And while this moment appeared administrative, almost mundane, it reflected a much larger shift that was unfolding across the world as empires expanded, governments centralized power, and populations became increasingly documented, categorized, and controlled through written records, replacing older systems of identity rooted in oral tradition, community recognition, and personal history with standardized surnames that could be tracked, taxed, and regulated. And over time, as terms like Tartary faded from maps, as borders hardened, and as names became permanent fixtures in bureaucratic systems, a question began to emerge among modern observers who look back at this transformation and wonder whether these changes were simply the natural evolution of governance and record-keeping, or whether they also obscured deeper connections to a past that is no longer clearly remembered. On the 12th of April 1676, in the remote Siberian administrative center of Tobolsk, a fur merchant named Ivan Petrovich stood before a wooden desk inside a dimly lit registry office, confirming a shipment of sable pelts destined for Moscow. Yet the name he provided to the clerk was not a fixed surname in the modern sense, but rather a shifting identifier that depended entirely on context, as Petrovich simply meant son of Peter, and in other records he might appear as Ivan of Tobolsk, Ivan the traitor, or even Ivan son of Pyotr, depending on who was documenting him and for what purpose, reflecting a broader reality across pre-18th century societies, where identity was not locked into a single inherited label, but instead existed as a flexible system shaped by relationships, geography, occupation, and social recognition, rather than bureaucratic permanence. This fluid approach to identity was not unique to Siberia, but was widespread across Europe, where parish records from the late 1500s and early 1600s reveal a striking inconsistency in naming practices, such as in the county of Kent, where on the 3rd of May 1587, a man might be recorded as Thomas Baker in one church document due to his profession, while in another he could appear as Thomas, son of William, depending on the priest's preference or the context of the record, illustrating how surnames were often descriptive rather than hereditary, and how individuals could move between identifiers throughout their lives without any sense of contradiction, since identity was understood as something lived and recognized within a community rather than formally assigned and permanently recorded. Across Central Asia, this flexibility became even more pronounced, particularly among Turkic and Mongol populations, where identity was deeply embedded in oral tradition and lineage rather than written documentation, as seen on the 21st of September 1698, when a caravan registry in Bukhara recorded a traveler as Arslan ibn Yusuf of the Kipchak, a name that simultaneously conveyed his father's identity, his tribal affiliation, and his geographic origin, functioning as a layered narrative rather than a fixed label. And within these societies, names could evolve over time as individuals migrated, gained status, or became associated with new communities, making identity a dynamic process rather than a static record. At the same time, European attempts to understand and map these regions introduced a different kind of simplification. As cartographers struggled to categorize vast and culturally complex territories that lay beyond their direct knowledge, leading to the widespread use of the term Tartary, which appeared prominently in maps such as those published in 1706 by Guillaume de Lisle, where enormous stretches of northern and central Asia were labeled under variations like Great Tartary or Independent Tartary. Not as clearly defined political entities, but as generalized placeholders that reflected both the limits of European geographical knowledge and the tendency to group diverse peoples under a single, broad term. This ambiguity was reinforced by travel accounts that circulated throughout Europe, particularly those attributed to Marco Polo, whose writings from circa 1298 describe journeys across Asia in vivid detail, yet were often interpreted by later readers as depicting a more unified and coherent region than actually existed, contributing to the perception of Tartary as a singular, almost mysterious expanse rather than a mosaic of distinct cultures, languages, and political systems. And, by the 17th century, this perception had become deeply embedded in European consciousness, despite its lack of precise definition. Within the societies being described, however, identity remained rooted in lived experience rather than external categorization, as individuals were known through their roles, relationships, and reputations within their communities, meaning that a blacksmith in Samarkand might be identified by his craft, his family lineage, or his place of residence depending on the situation, and these identifiers could shift naturally over time without any formal process of change, creating a system that was inherently resistant to centralization because it relied on local knowledge and social recognition rather than standardized documentation. In East Asia, similar patterns coexisted alongside more structured systems, particularly in China, where hereditary surnames had been established for centuries, yet still functioned within a broader cultural framework that emphasized clan identity and generational continuity, as demonstrated on the 14th of February 1682, when the Kangxi Emperor reinforced population registration systems within the Qing dynasty, ensuring administrative oversight while still allowing traditional naming conventions to persist, highlighting a balance between state control and cultural continuity that differed significantly from the rigid standardization that would emerge later in other parts of the world. This pre-modern landscape of identity, spanning from Europe to Asia, reveals a world in which names were not fixed anchors but evolving expressions of personal and communal identity, shaped by context rather than constrained by bureaucracy. And when viewed from a modern perspective, it can appear fragmented or inconsistent. Yet it also represented a form of identity that was deeply human, adaptable, and closely tied to lived reality, a stark contrast to the standardized systems that would begin to take hold in the centuries that followed. On the 24th of January 1719, Tsar Peter the Great initiated a series of administrative reforms that would fundamentally reshape how identity was recorded within the Russian Empire, driven by his broader ambition to modernize the state along Western European lines. And among these reforms was an increasing emphasis on taxation systems and population registries that required a level of consistency and traceability that had never previously existed, meaning that individuals who had once been known through flexible identifiers now needed to be recorded in a way that allowed the state to track them across time, space, and generations with far greater precision. This transformation was part of a much larger shift that had been unfolding across Europe for centuries, beginning as early as the 10th of August, 1539, when Francis I of France signed the Ordinance of Villers-Cotterets, a legal decree that required all official documents to be written in French instead of Latin, and mandated the systematic recording of baptisms, effectively laying the groundwork for more consistent naming practices by linking individuals to written records maintained by the state or church. And although this was initially intended to improve legal clarity, it also marked a significant step toward the standardization of identity. By the late 18th century, the need for administrative control had intensified across multiple empires, particularly within the Habsburg territories, where on the 12th of October, 1787, Emperor Joseph II issued a decree requiring Jewish populations to adopt permanent surnames, a policy that was implemented with varying degrees of sensitivity and coercion depending on the region, And in many cases, names were assigned by officials rather than chosen by families, resulting in surnames that reflected occupations, physical characteristics, or even arbitrary decisions made during the registration process, permanently altering how these communities identified themselves. Similar developments occurred within the German states, where growing bureaucratic systems demanded greater efficiency in record-keeping, as seen on the 3rd of March 1808 in Königsberg, when civil administrators enforced the use of consistent hereditary surnames for taxation and census purposes, transforming names like Jakob the Miller into Jakob Müller, and ensuring that this identifier would be passed down to future generations regardless of occupation, thereby shifting the function of names from descriptive markers to fixed hereditary labels embedded within state systems. On the 1st of June 1790, census reforms within the Austrian Empire further demonstrated how identity was becoming increasingly tied to administrative needs, as officials recorded detailed information about households including names, ages, occupations, and familial relationships, creating comprehensive datasets that allowed governments to manage their populations more effectively, but also reduced complex human identities into standardized categories that could be easily processed and controlled. Beyond Europe, colonial administrations adopted similar strategies as tools of governance, particularly within British-controlled India, where on the 2nd of July 1889, census operations expanded to classify millions of individuals according to rigid systems of name, caste, religion, and occupation, often simplifying or misinterpreting local traditions in the process. And while these classifications were intended to facilitate administration, they also reshaped social structures by reinforcing categories that became increasingly fixed over time. In Qing Dynasty China, the Baojia system provided another example of how states sought to organize and monitor their populations, grouping households into units for taxation and surveillance, while integrating existing naming traditions into official registries, thereby enhancing the government's ability to maintain control without entirely dismantling cultural practices, yet still contributing to a broader global trend toward the formalization of identity. What emerges from these developments is not a single coordinated effort, but a convergence of administrative needs across different societies, each moving towards systems that required stable, traceable identities in order to function effectively. And while the motivations were rooted in governance, taxation, and legal organization, the result was a profound transformation in how individuals understood themselves and their place within society. By the early 19th century, the cumulative effect of these reforms had created a new reality in which names were no longer fluid expressions of identity, but fixed components of a bureaucratic system, linking individuals to records that defined them in ways that were increasingly difficult to change. And this shift would lay the foundation for the modern concept of identity that continues to shape the world today. On the 17th of June, 1771, the first edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica included a detailed entry describing Tartary as an immense expanse stretching across northern Asia, inhabited by numerous tribes and governed by a variety of rulers, yet notably lacking any indication of a single, unified political structure, reflecting the limited and often second-hand geographical knowledge available to European scholars at the time, who relied heavily on travel accounts, fragmented reports, and earlier cartographic traditions to construct their understanding of distant regions, resulting in the use of broad and often ambiguous terms that grouped diverse cultures under a single label without fully capturing their complexity. This ambiguity is clearly visible in the work of Guillaume Delisle, whose 1,706 maps divided the region into categories such as Great Tartary, Chinese Tartary, and Independent Tartary, not as sovereign states with defined borders, but as conceptual zones that reflected both geographical approximation and cultural generalization, illustrating how European cartography at the time functioned as much as an interpretive exercise as it did a scientific one, shaped by the limitations of exploration and the perspectives of those creating the maps, rather than precise political realities on the ground. As the 18th and 19th centuries progressed, this broad terminology began to disappear, not through sudden removal, but through gradual replacement driven by expanding empires and increasing geographical knowledge, particularly as the Russian Empire pushed eastward into Siberia and Central Asia, transforming loosely understood territories into administratively defined regions that could be governed, taxed, and integrated into the imperial system, thereby eliminating the need for generalized labels like Tartary and replacing them with specific names tied to political control. On the 14th of August, 1865, Russian General Mikhail Chernyayev led a military campaign that resulted in the capture of Tashkent, marking a significant milestone in the Russian conquest of Central Asia and signaling the transition of the region from a loosely described frontier into a formally administered territory, a process that continued in the following decades as additional cities and regions were incorporated into the empire, each acquisition further refining the map and reducing the reliance on outdated terminology. By May 1884, the strategic oasis city of Merv had also fallen under Russian control, completing a major phase of territorial expansion that effectively absorbed much of what had once been labeled as Tartary into clearly defined imperial regions, such as Turkestan, and as administrative structures were established, detailed surveys conducted, and infrastructure developed, cartographers updated their maps to reflect this new reality, replacing vague designations with precise borders and officially recognized place names. Meanwhile, in East Asia, the Qing dynasty had already consolidated its control over vast territories through military campaigns led by the Qianlong Emperor between 1755 and 1759, particularly against the Dzungar Khanate, bringing regions like Xinjiang firmly under imperial authority and further diminishing the relevance of broad external labels such as Tartary, as local governance structures and official naming systems took precedence over foreign interpretations. By the late 19th century, European atlases presented a dramatically different view of Asia compared to those produced just a century earlier, with the term Tartary largely absent and replaced by clearly defined regions such as Siberia, Mongolia, and Manchuria, reflecting not the disappearance of a civilization, but the evolution of geographical knowledge and political control. Yet for modern observers encountering these older maps, the contrast can appear striking, as if a vast entity has been removed from the historical record. This visual transformation has become a focal point for alternative interpretations, particularly within narratives that suggest the existence of a lost or obscured civilization, as the sudden absence of a once prominent label invites questions about what it truly represented and why it vanished. And while historians attribute this change to increased accuracy and imperial expansion, others view it as evidence of something more deliberate, demonstrating how the same set of historical documents can lead to vastly different conclusions depending on the perspective through which they are interpreted. On the 3rd of March, 1808, inside a Prussian civil office in Königsberg, a government registrar sat behind a thick oak desk surrounded by ink pots, ledgers, and stacks of parchment that carried the weight of a rapidly changing world. And as each individual approached to have their identity recorded under new administrative requirements, something subtle but irreversible began to take place, because what had once been a flexible and situational way of identifying oneself was being reshaped into a fixed, hereditary system, where a man previously known within his community as Jakob the Miller, Jakob son of Hans, or Jakob of Königsberg would now be officially recorded as Jakob Müller, a name that would not only define him within the records of the state, but would be passed unchanged to his children and their descendants, anchoring his identity permanently within a bureaucratic structure that demanded consistency above all else. This shift was not sudden, nor was it confined to a single region, but by the late 18th and early 19th centuries, It had accelerated across Europe as states expanded their administrative reach and required more efficient ways to track populations for taxation, military service, and legal governance, particularly within the Habsburg Empire, where, on the 12th of October 1787, Joseph II issued a decree mandating that Jewish families adopt permanent surnames, a policy that fundamentally altered centuries of naming traditions in which individuals had been identified through patronymics, community associations, or religious lineage. And while some families were allowed to select names that reflected their heritage, many others had surnames assigned to them by officials who often chose based on occupation, physical traits, or even arbitrary preferences, resulting in identities that were imposed rather than inherited through organic cultural continuity. In Ireland, a different but equally transformative process unfolded over a longer period, as British administrative systems gradually replaced Gaelic naming traditions with anglicized forms that fit within English linguistic and bureaucratic frameworks, and by the early 19th century, names such as O'Brien had been systematically recorded as O'Brien, while MacGabhan became Smith. Changes that were reinforced through legal documents, land records, and educational systems that prioritized English usage, effectively reshaping identity, not through a single moment of enforcement, but through sustained pressure that made the original forms increasingly difficult to maintain within official contexts. At the same time, the expansion of bureaucratic states across Eastern Europe and the Russian Empire introduced further layers of standardization, particularly as diverse populations were incorporated into centralized administrative systems that required names to conform to specific linguistic structures, often adding suffixes such as ov, ev, or in to align with Russian conventions, thereby transforming local names into forms that could be more easily integrated into official records, while subtly altering their original pronunciation and meaning, creating a standardized identity that was legible to the state, but not always reflective of its cultural origins. On the 1st of June 1790, census reforms within the Austrian Empire demonstrated how deeply this transformation was tied to governance, as officials began recording entire households with unprecedented detail, documenting names, ages, occupations, and familial relationships in a systematic manner that allowed the state to view its population as a structured dataset rather than a collection of loosely connected communities. And while this brought a new level of administrative efficiency, it also required that identities be fixed and consistent, eliminating the flexibility that had once allowed individuals to adapt their names according to context. Beyond Europe, similar processes were unfolding under colonial administrations, particularly within British-controlled India, where on the 2nd of July, 1889, expanded census operations categorized millions of individuals according to rigid classifications that included standardized names, often simplifying or modifying complex local naming systems in order to fit administrative needs. And while these changes were presented as tools of organization, they also introduced a level of rigidity that reshaped how identity was understood, both by the state and by the individuals being recorded. What makes this moment in history so significant is not merely the introduction of surnames, but the transformation of names into permanent, inheritable markers that linked individuals to a centralized system of documentation, creating a framework in which identity was no longer defined primarily by community recognition or personal narrative, but by official records that carried legal authority and could not easily be altered without navigating bureaucratic processes, effectively transferring control over identity from the individual to the state. Within alternative interpretations, this widespread and near-simultaneous shift across multiple regions is sometimes viewed as more than a coincidence of administrative evolution, with some suggesting that the standardization of names may have played a role in disconnecting populations from older systems of identity that were less easily controlled or documented. And while mainstream historical evidence attributes these changes to practical governance needs, the scale and permanence of the transformation continue to raise questions about what may have been lost when fluid identities were replaced with fixed ones. The result was a new reality in which names became anchors within a vast and interconnected system of records, defining individuals in ways that extended far beyond their immediate communities and persisting across generations with a stability that had never previously existed, marking the end of a world where identity could shift and evolve freely, and the beginning of one in which it was recorded, standardized, and preserved in forms that would shape personal and collective history for centuries to come. On the 9th of September 1821, inside a parish office in Warsaw, a priest leaned over a large registry book bound in worn leather, carefully transcribing the details of a local family into a newly structured record system that required consistent surnames and standardized spelling. And in that moment, as ink met paper, a transformation occurred that extended beyond simple documentation, because the name being written down was not merely recorded but effectively fixed, replacing earlier forms of identification that may have varied across generations or contexts. And as this written version became the official reference for future records, it began to override the fluid and often more complex identity that had existed before it was captured in writing. Throughout the 19th century, similar scenes unfolded across Europe as both church and state expanded their record-keeping systems, creating increasingly detailed registries of births, marriages, and deaths that required individuals to be identified in consistent ways. And while these systems brought greater organization and continuity to administrative processes, they also introduced a level of rigidity that gradually erased variations in naming that had once been common, as different spellings, pronunciations, and contextual identifiers were consolidated into a single, standardized form that could be easily recorded and retrieved. In many cases, the individuals responsible for recording these names were not the same as those who carried them, leading to discrepancies that would later appear as inconsistencies in historical documents, particularly in regions where multiple languages and dialects intersected, and as clerks translated or adapted names to fit official spelling conventions, subtle changes were introduced that could alter pronunciation, meaning, or cultural significance. And once these altered forms were entered into official records, they often became the default version used in all subsequent documentation, effectively rewriting identity through the act of transcription. On the 17th of April, 1852, during intensified census operations within the Austrian Empire, officials documented entire households with a level of detail that would have been unimaginable in earlier centuries. Yet, in doing so, they often reduced complex family histories into simplified entries that prioritized clarity and uniformity over nuance. And as these records accumulated, they began to replace oral traditions as the primary source of genealogical knowledge, shifting the authority of identity from memory and community to documentation and bureaucracy. In Eastern Europe and Central Asia, this process was further complicated by the integration of diverse populations into imperial systems that imposed linguistic and administrative standards, often modifying names to align with official norms, adding suffixes, altering phonetics, or translating meanings in ways that made them more consistent with the dominant language of governance. And while these changes facilitated administration, they also created layers of transformation that could obscure the original form and context of a name over time. Within the framework of alternative narratives, particularly those associated with Tartaria, these widespread modifications are sometimes interpreted as evidence of deliberate rewriting, suggesting that the standardization and alteration of names may have served to disconnect individuals from older identities tied to a broader and less understood past. And although historical evidence supports the explanation of administrative necessity, the sheer scale of these changes, combined with the loss of earlier records and oral histories, creates an environment in which such interpretations can emerge and persist. What is historically verifiable, however, is that the transition from oral to written identity fundamentally changed how lineage was preserved, as once a name was recorded in an official document, it gained a level of authority that could override alternative versions, and over generations, as families relied increasingly on these records to understand their own histories. Earlier forms of identity that were not documented began to fade, leaving gaps that are difficult to reconstruct with certainty. This shift also introduced a new kind of permanence, where identity became tied to documents that could outlast the individuals they described, creating a record-based legacy that defined how future generations would perceive the past. Yet at the same time, it limited the ability of individuals to adapt or reinterpret their identities in response to changing circumstances, effectively freezing names in a form that may not fully reflect their original meaning or origin. The cumulative effect of these processes was not an immediate erasure, but a gradual transformation, in which layers of documentation replaced layers of memory, and as each new record reinforced the standardized version of a name, the connection to earlier forms became increasingly distant, creating a historical landscape where identity appears stable and continuous on the surface. But beneath that stability lies a complex history of adaptation, translation, and change that continues to invite investigation and interpretation. On the 1st of May, 1893, as crowds gathered in Chicago for the grand opening of the World's Columbian Exposition, visitors were met with a city of gleaming white structures, rising from the ground with a scale and uniformity that seemed almost impossible for the time. Vast neoclassical buildings with massive columns, domes, and intricate ornamentation stretching across the fairgrounds, creating what became known as the White City. And while official records detail the rapid construction of these buildings using staff, a plaster-like material applied over temporary frameworks, the visual impact left a lasting impression that would later fuel questions about how such monumental architecture could appear so suddenly and then disappear just as quickly after the exposition ended. Photographs taken during the late 19th and early 20th centuries across cities in the United States, Europe, and parts of Asia reveal urban landscapes filled with grand buildings that appear oversized relative to the populations they served at the time, with wide boulevards, elaborate facades, and monumental civic structures that seem to reflect a level of wealth and technological capability that does not always align with conventional narratives of gradual industrial development, leading some observers to question whether these buildings were truly constructed within the short timeframes documented or whether they may have been inherited from an earlier period. In cities like St. Petersburg, Paris, and New York, architectural styles such as neoclassicism and Beaux Arts dominated public construction during the 18th and 19th centuries, drawing inspiration from ancient Greek and Roman designs. Yet the consistency and scale of these structures have led to speculation that they may represent remnants of a more advanced or unified architectural tradition, particularly within narratives that associate them with the idea of a lost Tartarian civilization, suggesting that these buildings were not created by the societies that claimed them, but rather repurposed and rebranded within a new historical framework. On the 27th of September, 1854, construction began on sections of the Crystal Palace in London, following its original assembly for the Great Exhibition of 1851, demonstrating that large-scale, prefabricated architecture was indeed possible during this period. Yet even with such examples, questions persist regarding the speed, coordination, and global consistency of monumental construction projects across different regions, especially when viewed through the lens of modern expectations about labor, logistics, and technological capability. Mainstream historians point to detailed architectural plans, construction records, and photographic evidence that document the building processes of these structures, including the use of large labor forces, evolving engineering techniques, and industrial materials, emphasizing that what appears sudden is often the result of decades of incremental development that may not be immediately visible in a single snapshot of time. Yet for those exploring alternative interpretations, the visual evidence itself becomes the starting point for questioning the established timeline. Within the Tartarian narrative, architecture becomes one of the central pieces of evidence used to support the idea of a lost civilization, as the presence of grand, uniform buildings across multiple continents is interpreted as the remnants of a global culture that existed prior to the 19th century. And when combined with the disappearance of the term Tartary from maps and the standardization of names within administrative systems, these elements are woven together into a broader theory, suggesting that history, as it is currently understood, may be incomplete. What makes this argument compelling to some is not necessarily the absence of explanations, but the contrast between the scale of these structures and the perceived capabilities of the societies that built them, particularly when viewed without the full context of industrialization and architectural evolution, creating a sense of discontinuity that invites alternative interpretations, especially when combined with gaps or inconsistencies in historical records. The question of whether these buildings represent lost knowledge or simply misunderstood history remains a point of debate, but what is clear is that architecture serves as a powerful visual anchor for the broader narrative, bridging the gap between abstract ideas about identity and tangible structures that can still be seen and experienced today, making it one of the most enduring and visually compelling aspects of the Tartaria discussion. On the 18th of April, 1906, the city of San Francisco was struck by a devastating earthquake that ruptured the San Andreas Fault, causing widespread destruction as buildings collapsed and fires spread uncontrollably for days, leaving large portions of the city in ruins and buried beneath layers of debris, ash, and reconstruction materials. And while this event is well documented with photographs, eyewitness accounts, and engineering reports, it has also been retrospectively cited within alternative historical narratives as an example of how entire urban landscapes can be rapidly altered, buried, and rebuilt within a relatively short period of time. Across older cities around the world, from London to Rome to Moscow, there are buildings with windows and doorways that appear partially submerged below current street level, often interpreted by historians as the result of gradual urban development in which streets were raised over time due to infrastructure improvements, sediment accumulation, and repeated reconstruction. Yet within the Tartaria narrative, these features are viewed differently, as evidence of a global event, sometimes referred to as a mud flood, which is proposed to have buried large portions of an earlier civilization. On the 10th of October, 1871, the Great Chicago Fire destroyed much of the city's central district, leading to rapid rebuilding efforts that included raising street levels and redesigning infrastructure. And similar patterns can be observed in other cities that experienced fires, floods, or earthquakes, where layers of construction accumulate over time, creating the appearance of buried structures when viewed from a modern perspective. Yet these documented processes are often reinterpreted within alternative frameworks as part of a larger and more sudden event. The mud flood theory suggests that at some point during the 18th or 19th century, a widespread catastrophic event deposited massive amounts of earth across urban areas, partially burying existing buildings and effectively resetting civilization, a claim that is not supported by geological or historical evidence, but persists due to the visual consistency of certain architectural features that appear across multiple regions, combined with gaps in documentation that leave room for speculation. What gives this theory traction is the way it connects physical observations with broader questions about history, as the presence of buried windows or lower-level entrances creates a tangible point of curiosity that can be directly observed, leading individuals to question how and why these features exist. And when combined with other elements, such as the disappearance of Tartary from maps and the standardization of names, it forms part of a larger narrative that seeks to explain perceived inconsistencies in the historical record. Mainstream explanations emphasize that cities are constantly evolving environments where construction, demolition, and infrastructure changes occur over long periods of time, often resulting in layers that can give the impression of sudden burial when viewed without context. And detailed urban studies, archaeological findings, and engineering records provide extensive evidence supporting these gradual processes. Yet the simplicity of a single catastrophic explanation can sometimes be more intuitively appealing than complex, multi-layered historical developments. Within the broader narrative, the mud flood theory functions as a bridge between physical evidence and conceptual ideas about lost civilizations, offering a mechanism through which large-scale changes could have occurred rapidly and without widespread documentation, even though such an event would likely have left clear geological and historical traces that are not observed in the scientific record. Despite this, the imagery associated with buried architecture continues to capture attention, serving as a visual entry point into a larger discussion about how history is recorded, interpreted, and sometimes questioned, reinforcing the idea that even well-documented events can be re-examined through different perspectives, leading to entirely different conclusions about the past.